This is Canada Reads American Style, featuring two friends who love Canada Reads and Canadian literature. Welcome our host Rebecca from Michigan and Tara from Ontario. Hi everyone, it is Rebecca, and today I am speaking with author Saad Omar Khan. Saad was born in the United Arab Emirates to Pakistani parents and lived in the Philippines, Hong Kong, and South Korea before immigrating to Canada. He is a graduate of the University of Toronto and the London School of Economics and has completed a certificate in creative writing from the School of Continuing Studies at the University of Toronto. His short fiction has appeared in Best Canadian Stories 2025 and other publications. His debut novel, Drinking the Ocean, was published by Wolsak and Wynn in May of this year, and it's the book we will be talking about today. Saad lives outside of Toronto and is currently working on his second novel, which I'm happy to hear about. Saad, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, I will let everybody know, as always, full transparency, I did request a copy of your novel from Halley at River Street Writes because I was immediately drawn to the description of the book. And it's not something I normally would be necessarily, but there was something that seemed a little mysterious in a way, and it absolutely grabbed my attention. So can you tell us about your novel and how you came to write about the subject of lost love?
Sure. The way that I usually pitch this novel is that it's a story of two characters in the relationship, one coming from a religious background who is veering away from religion, another person coming from a more liberal secular background who is kind of attracted to religion in her own very unique way. And it's about the relationship. I always describe, so I should go back saying that these are two Pakistani Canadians. They meet in London, and then they reconnect later on in the narrative. And for me, the way that I describe it is that people often describe this as a love story, which it is. I like arguing that this is a story about love. And for me, it's a bit of a qualitative difference between those two things because the themes that I wanted to kind of bring out in this book are the fundamental conflict between divine sacred love and worldly earthly love, and also familial love and all different forms of that. And a lot of this was coming from my own personal experience. I mean, there's certain aspects of this book that came directly from my life. I don't like going too into details because I also want to emphasize to people that whatever aspects of this are like coming from me in terms of my own life, it's not a straight up memoir. In fact, it's not a memoir at all. It's a fully invented story. Um, and it is a story where that's one of the reasons why I also wanted to have, for those who read this book, it has this like, diptych style where you see Murad's perspective on things, then you go into Sophie, the other character's perspective on things. And for me, it was really important to balance those two narrative strains to give a balance of, who these characters are, but also give a balance of the themes between like worldly and spiritual love as represented by those two characters. So that's what I really want to like bring out in this story.
Okay, that's so funny that you say that because that's what initially drew me was this idea of this lost love thing. But then I wrote another question that I was going to throw at you, which is when I kind of reviewed the book again yesterday, uh, that's what I wanted to say was Murad was strong in his Muslim faith. And yet when he was younger, and then as he gets older, he sort of loses his way. And then it's the exact opposite for Sophie because she's raised by parents who it's not important to them. And she develops that. And that trajectory of her growth just is I anyway, I love that aspect of the book so much. And so can you talk a little bit more about that faith journey for both of these characters?
Yeah, and I didn't want it to make it too dualistic. I think that there's a certain complexity with both those characters. So Murad is somebody who comes from a very traditional background. He's somebody who was also, I think, as a person, attracted to faith in his earlier years. But I think through the process of facing challenges in his own life, including like depression, mental illness is also a theme in the story. It seeps out of him. So it's not like a dramatic thing or like that happens to him. It really is that like he just loses that fervency and an emotional connection to God and by extension to religion. Whereas with Sophie, I wanted to portray a character who is coming from a background which is not atheistic, but as you mentioned, it's not really that important. And it's not really important to her. And it's not the lifestyle that she usually leads. But at the same time, due to her own sense of loss. So early on in the novel, it's revealed that she's lost her brother. She finds this attraction to God because it anchors her to a world that she's feeling increasingly disconnected to. And I think that seeing that duality was really important to me, but it's not as black and white as, Rod's demanding religion, because there's something in that still has an imprint to him. Similarly, with Sophie, it's not as simple that she becomes overwhelmingly religious. I think that for those who read this book, she'll find that. So I don't like using the term orthodoxy in a Muslim context because I don't think that usually fits. But this idea that her standards for living as a Muslim are just different from people around her. So I introduce a cousin of her who is more religious in Orthodox sense as a kind of a foil to see that contrast in how she gets attracted to religion. For Sophie, it is something that is very internal and very emotional, very deep, even though it's not typical as far as the way that she may practice religion as others do.
Yeah, and I think too, it's like you said in your opening. Again, I'm somebody who I don't traditionally read, or I should say it this way. I don't read traditional love stories because they often that trajectory of they meet, they fall in love, there's some conflict, and then they decide they want to live happily ever after. That's not as appealing to me. I did that when I was younger. But in this book, as you said, it's really about love in so many different ways. It presents itself differently, and that is the beauty of this novel. Because again, with Murad, you see how his life has turned out, and then you see that connection that he had with Sophie, and then just the way they are together, they're apart, they're together. That whole aspect of just love is woven through the story, but it's not that traditional boy meets girl kind of love story. And so I'm not even sure what I'm trying to say other than Sophie's awakening to what is important to her in her life and how she views her past relationship with him and her life going forward. There's just this overwhelming sense of a divine love, a love that isn't. And I want to be clear about this for people because there are some people who will absolutely not want to read something about religion or something like that. It is so not that. This story is about two people in a real sense of what life is, right? Okay, I've gone on way too long. Do you want to respond to anything I
No, no,
just said?
no, like completely. And the thing is that, like I think you've hit the nail on the head. Like I did want to create a multi-layered narrative. And to your point about people who may be attracted to this story or not, based on the religious aspects, there's no proselytization in this novel. My goal is both as a writer and, to be honest, as somebody who identifies as an observant Muslim, is just to reify and dramatize a human experience. Now, in a secular world, it's easy to say that religion is something to the past or is simply something that, the fools of this world really delve into because God is dead and end of story. And my rejoinder to that is no, that's not the end of the story. These two characters are smart, they're intelligent, they're complex, and their attitudes to religion are complex. It's not a black and white thing for both of them. And the idea of, like, really struggling with an emotional tie to God is not an abstract one. Like, people do this. This is something that, like, I know enough people, I've experienced it my own self also. This is something that, like, it's an internal debate that people do have. And if literature as a if the goal of literature is to document the gambit of the human experience, well, this is part of the human experience. You know, part of the human experience is receiving and getting hurt from worldly love. It's also getting hurt from divine love too, or finding fulfillment through divine love. This is what humans do, and this is not what humans did in, like, the 16th century. This is something that people in the 21st century experience. And I would ask any reader who may be a bit wary about going to the story is to give it a chance, because I think that this narrative works on several different levels. If you want to see it as a pure romance, that is there. It's certainly there. If you want to see it as something a bit different, or a bit deeper, where people can also look into how people balance romantic love with that spiritual love, I personally think that there's an added level of fulfillment that you can get for that, even for those who are not interested in divine love. I mean, it's again, it's a human experience. So I would just ask people to just be open to that as they get into this. And it goes back to what I said earlier. It's, yeah, this is a love story, but this is a story about love, the different types of which. Again, those are all parts of the human experience, the way that we relate to our families, our lovers, to God. People do experience this. Why not, dive into that and see how people actually live this way?
Yeah. Okay, you just said that perfectly, and I do wanna tell you that's so funny, I didn't even think about saying this until everything you just said. So I've had my own, ups and downs with my faith, so I have I was away from it for 30 years, came back to it, left it again, and I have to laugh because when I was reading some of the quotes I've marked in the book because they hit like a gut punch, and it actually started to, believe it or not, it's hard to put me back on that path. And I'm getting emotional because, again, you can read this book on so many different levels, but it can also have an effect in the reading of it because it's just such a beautiful layered story. So sorry about that. I didn't mean to get all emotional, but
No,
yeah.
but I think that it's again, it also, so, and this may like tie into some of the other questions you have. When I was writing this book, because I'm writing about two Muslim characters, in the early part of the 21st century, there's always this question of who is this for? And my response is everyone. Like this, I don't have limits of who can or should read my work. Like I don't care what your identities are. I mean, all literature is both very specific and also universal. And like, thank you for sharing that, because I would also think that like you do not need to be a Muslim to be attracted to the story or to have it speak to you, as especially if you are from a religious background, or do have that within your heart. Like I would hope that this also speaks to something within you, if you, like as you said, move back and forth between being attracted to divine worship and divine love or not, especially if that's something that you're raised with. Again, it's a human story, and I think that you perfectly demonstrated this idea that like it has an appeal beyond like the narrow confines of who these characters are. So thank you for that, and thank you for also like mentioning that, because I one of the hopes that I had with this work is that it has an appeal outside people of within my own demographic, and I think you just proved that. So thank you again.
Absolutely, 100%, I would say that, yes. Now, one of the things I really love, because I know it's kind of in the book, it's a little hidden gem there, but can you tell us about the title, Drinking the Ocean?
I do, and with your permission, I'd actually like to read the poem that it's from, and just a
Yes.
bit of a snippet, because I think that will probably illustrate why I chose that title. So this is from one of the first parts of the novel, where one of the main characters, Murad, is reading a poem from a book of Sufi poetry that his aunt had given him. From his backpack, he took out the book Khala had gifted him. He flipped to a random page and read a snippet of a poem. My heart thirsts. I long for only a drop. The caravan's jug is not enough, since I seek the ocean. He ached with the thought of Sophie when he read that. This is what he needed, the ocean, not the drop. Intense love. Not abstract divine love, but real love, the line that shines underneath dark lashes and eyes the color of space. So, just for a bit of context, this poem, and I had to alter it a bit from the original translation, is a translation of a poem from a Sufi poet and scholar by the name of Abdullah Ansari. He was from Herat in modern day Afghanistan. And I read this poem, I mean, when I was in my early 20s, and I read the book of poetry, which translated poetry, which I have next to me right now as I speak. And it was a perfect encapsulation of what I feel are the themes of this novel. You see in the story somebody like Murad, who, again, coming from a religious background, but it just doesn't speak to him. But what speaks to him now is the fact that he's fallen in love with this woman, and just this idea that he doesn't want just like a sliver of love. He wants it all. He wants the ocean, not a drop. Now, the context of this story is that of this poem is that Abdullah Ansari is talking about divine love fundamentally. He wants the ocean of God's love. And if you ever study the Islamic tradition, God is often compared to an ocean. Like oceanic imagery is like a trope that you find, especially in Sufi poetry, because there's something that's very expansive about the ocean. There's also something very comforting about the ocean, too. So you kind of see that balance between, like, somebody like Sophie, who is veering towards God because of that oceanic capacity for love and memory. One of the other themes is the fact that, if God is eternal and God remembers all of his creation, then God has preserved all the people that we've lost. Contrast that to somebody like Murad, who wants the exact same love, but love that you can touch, not the abstract love of divine love. And I think that for me, so this was not the original title of the story. I originally wanted to call it Distance because I wanted to evoke the idea of, like, people being distant from themselves and God. And, like, I remember one of my early writing mentors was like, "That's a terrible title," and he was right, because it's way too abstract. Whereas there's something about drinking the ocean that is more concrete, which also speaks to the themes of, like, Murad wants a concrete love that he can touch and hold. But at the same time, Sophie wants a divine love that she can also touch and hold, even if it's not a physical touch. It's an emotional touch also.
Oh, I love that. Yeah, and I'm glad you got the title you got because it's poetic, it's beautiful, it has so much imagery and meaning. I love that. So the next question I ask is not to imply that different genders can't write different genders in stories. However, I loved the character of Sophie so much, and I wondered how you approached writing female characters because she really rang true. Like I felt her soul. It was just so beautiful.
Honestly, I didn't have any specific plan of how to write female characters. In my shorter works, I've written female characters before. And I think the only thing I can say to that is that try to write Sophie the way that I wrote Murad, which is to say, I removed myself from the equation as much as possible. Even though,
Oh,
like, Sophie is a part of me, and I can also gush about, like, the attraction that I have to both of these characters in my own life. But I did really try to, and this is going to sound like glib and simplistic, really just try to imagine who Sophie was.
yeah.
All aspects of her gender, her identity, who she's coming from. And Sophie, I mean, even apart from gender, is a very different person from me. But at the same time, I just, my goal was just to see if I can inhabit in my own mind somebody like Sophie. Certainly, Sophie has her origins in somebody I know, and people I know in general. I grew up with women. I grew up with having lots of female friends. I try to just, like, imagine how they would think about things. I had tried to imagine how the real Sophie just would experience life. So it really is just doing what all writers do, which is just, remove the I of the author and really deeply dive into who you would think this character is. Um, and that's how I try to do that. And by the way, thank you for saying that Sophie, like, ranked true as a female. I think any male author may be a bit nervous about that because, and that's true of all the characters, but especially if they're writing across gender lines. I would like I would like to say that, like, I wrote, Sophie perfectly from the outset, but at the same time, even through the editing process, there were times when, like, I had editors who were like, "You're writing Sophie the way that a man would." There's a bit of the male gaze that's kind of interfering with that. And I'll give you a concrete example. There's this part of the novel where Sophie's looking at the mirror, and one of my editors made this point: is that is not the way that I, as a woman, would look at the mirror. You know what I mean? Like, this is, like, clearly the male gaze. And she was right. And I had to rethink of how I wrote that particular scene to, again, like, remove the I from me too. So as confident as I can be as a male writer writing female story, like, characters, it's always good to have that little bit of humility to be injected in you, so that, like, you just need that other voices to basically say that, you could have written this a bit better. But
Yeah.
again, like, I'm so glad that she actually ran true to you.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I think, okay, I'll just say this because I really believe this. I think a great author is one who can do that, can really write characters across gender, and it has and it rings true, right? Because we know there are we've all read a lot of male authors who wrote female characters that you went, "Are you kidding me? That is not how that would go." Or vice versa. You know, women will write male characters that you think, "Oh, you're like that's not really." And then again, that's not I'm just saying in general, we know that the spectrum of gender and expression, etc., there it isn't binary. I get that. But I'm just saying that there are times when I'll read one or the other and I go, God, it's just so not it just doesn't feel authentic. And these characters feel very, very authentic. And I loved Sophie. So she's going to be one of those characters that will live with me for a very, very long time, truthfully.
I'm so glad. And if I could just add in more to that as well,
Yeah.
like I think that if I was giving a lesson on like how to write characters to like any creative writing class and using Sophie as example, like the best thing that I can say is that you're this is really obvious, but it can't be overstated. Your characters aren't you. Even if they're based on you, even if they are inspired by you or people you know, you have to just invent them. And the best way is observe people. Like if you're a male author writing female characters, as again as simplistic as it sounds, like talk to women. Like seriously, talk
Yeah.
like just talk like just listen. Like shut up and listen. And just absorb and observe and really like imbibe who your characters are within yourself and removing yourself from the equation within entirety. Is that easy to do? No. I mean, it goes back to the idea of is empathy the foundation of any literature? Like empathy in the literal sense of really feeling what somebody else feels. And that just really depends on whether you as a writer can be truly empathetic in that sense. And I think that it's a skill as much as an inner trait that we have as authors. You just have to develop it. And the best way of developing is that squash that ego and just inhabit and live other characters. Kind of the way that method actors live their characters in their own lives. I would put it that way.
Yeah, that's a really good example. Yeah. Now, I also want to talk to you just about your writing, you as an author, because I'm fascinated by authors. I mean, other people are into actors and athletes or whatever. I kind of sort of fangirl over authors. So let me ask you this. How in the world did you become a writer? And was it always a goal? And those are very simplistic questions, but I kind of want to get into that idea of how is it you decided this is your craft, and how do authors just like have a freaking different mindset than the rest of us who just are readers? I just am curious.
I would say it was probably always a secret goal. So my first taste of being an author and having my work recognized is at the tender age of 8, when
Ooh.
I wrote I think there was like some class assignment where like my teacher, like a wonderful teacher named Miss Wellington. This is when I used to live in South Korea and I went to an American school. Now, this is kind of an aside, but like, this is the kind of cosmopolitan international world I lived in. I was a Pakistani living in South Korea, studying in an American school, being taught by a Canadian teacher from British Columbia. And I know this because Miss Wellington always used to talk about how much she like missed and loved British Columbia. Anyway, that's an aside. So I wrote this play about like a knight killing a dragon, something to that effect. And for whatever reason, Miss Wellington loved it so much, she made the class like enact it. She got like some of the more extroverted students to like be the actors there, and I became kind of a playwright at the age of 8. And I often like joke to people that like had Drinking the Ocean ever been published, my writing career would have peaked at the age of 8 and would have crashed and burned after that. But I think there was something about that experience that gave me a taste of like, oh, I can actually create something that can connect with people, even though I would obviously not have articulated that at that level at that age. As cliche as it seems, like a lot of it is just like loving reading at a very early age. I have to thank my parents who always had books around the house and was very comfortable with me having books. One of my a friend of the family used to joke that whenever I used to like visit them like as a child, they're like, why is this like small child with these huge glasses always bringing nothing but books wherever he goes? So there's that aspect. Now, not every reader becomes a writer, right? I think that there is something about this attraction, this need to create at a very early age that comes out. Like a certain aspect of that is like the need for recognition that does come out, and I'd be lying if I said that was a part of it. But a lot of it is just innate, and a lot of it is just it's an itch that you need to scratch. When I was about 14, typical age, like grade 9 high school, people are asking you what do you want to be, and I think that I told my family I want to be a writer, and me saying that I want to be a writer was the equivalent of me saying that I've been dealing drugs during like during my spare hours at school. Like they had to have an intervention because like you need to think practically and have a real job. And I have to thank them for that because there is something about concentrating on things other than writing that I think is extremely healthy for writers. Uh, Again, cliche, you need life experience, and I got life experience out of that. I only started writing in earnest in my actually when I was writing this story. I mean, I written like a couple of short stories, which later got published, like around my like mid 20s, because again, there was just something about like the writing bug that was just in me that I can't really articulate it, and I think that it got rekindled when I was in university, and I just had like access to more books, and I was reading more, and I was just in this like very intellectually fertile environment. And I should say, I never studied English literature or literature at all in
Wow.
my undergrad or even in the 2 master's degrees that I have. It was something that was kind of like a side quest in the journey of my professional life. And it was through reading that I was just like, there's some experience that I just want to document. I just don't know how. In my mid 20s, I was going through a lot, and I kind of alluded to this earlier. I was having some personal challenges, and that's what motivated me to be like, I need to write this specific novel if it kills me. I need to write it, and I need to finish this manuscript, even if nothing happens to it. And nothing did happen to it for about a decade.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
yeah, it's well. Here's the thing: like during that point, I was like also writing short stories that got published, which obviously like kind of gave me the impetus to write more. But it was during that time I was like, you know what, I was at such a low point in my life that I was like, you know what, one of the few things that like really engages me is writing. This story I need to write. I'll write other stories also, but I need to see this through the end. And if I fail, I fail. But I can't regret not doing this. I think that there are a lot of extremely talented people who are perfectly capable of writing outstanding works of fiction who don't do it because they don't set them up for success by basically giving them by not putting like set goals on them.
Mhm.
Long story short, yeah, I had like a few publications there, and I started writing this novel, if you can imagine, in 2007. I'm aging myself also. I finished the first draft of the manuscript in 2014. I was kind of like going through the editing process for a few years, also trying to find agents and publishers without success until 2023. So the gestation period between me putting pen to paper and me seeing a physical copy of this book was 18 years. I really hope my second novel doesn't take that long. I do not have that much life in me, but it's also a lesson that like any writer can tell you that this is very much a marathon, very much a sprint, and nothing's guaranteed. Like, you can get success within 5 years, you can get success within 15 years. The time happens when it happens. But at the very least, like, I can say that there's something in like physically holding this book in my hand, which I know this is an audio medium, but like, just seeing this is a fulfillment of a childhood goal, even if it's a childhood goal that I didn't really articulate to myself as a child, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. That so the fact that you didn't have that literature background, I do think, yes, you're a reader, you were a reader and a voracious reader, but you still I think there must be an inherent talent for it though. Do you know what I'm saying? Because I'm telling you, as a first novel, it's pretty darn amazing. And yeah, I don't know. Do you see what I'm trying to say? That
Yeah,
you had to have some inborn. I mean, I get because I'm a reader too, but I know I don't have the ability to do what you did. And so I'm looking at it going like there's got to be some inherent talent that you are born with or something. I really believe that.
Yeah, I would say to that maybe, and the reason why I'm saying maybe rather than a firm yes is because partly because I think that if I talk about my talent, again, I'm an observant Muslim, and there's something about like modesty and humility that's a virtue that I have to like put into my mind constantly. Be like, Saudi may be talented, but like, give it a rest.
Yeah.
So that's why I always emphasize that, like, look, objectively speaking, if you ask if I personally have a talent for writing, I would say probably. Maybe there's just something within me that just has a facility with words. And more than that, a facility with storytelling, because you can be really good at
Yep.
words at an academic level, but writing a story is something that happens, through the process of actually, like, writing.
Yep.
I would say this, though. There are three parts of being a writer. One of them is an innate talent, which I just described it again like an attraction to and a facility with using words properly. A lot of it's tenacity, and any like writer could tell you it's like, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, it's a drive to actually want to write. A lot of it is dumb luck. Like, I lucked out finding my publisher. I could
Mhm.
have been luckier by finding this publisher later on, or like actually like having this within the eyes of certain agents, like 10 years prior. It just didn't work out that way, but it did work out right now. A lot of it is also taking the risk on you. It is very hard to get published. Anybody would tell you this. It's never been easy, and it's getting a lot less easy because fewer people are reading.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there is still like a market for literature, and it's not something that like people in the late 70s are doing. Like, people of all ages like love to read, and they want to read like quality work. But and if I would say this to any young reader, or like writer rather, who is listening to this, do not underestimate the the advantage of having somebody who has your back with this. Like, I'm very lucky with my publisher; they took the risk on me. They didn't have to, and I've solicited my work to other publishers, and other agents who liked it, but maybe they didn't fall in love with it, or they liked it, but were like, I don't know how to market this. It is like people like the kindness of people within the industry who'll be like, you know what, I see something in this, and I want your voice to be heard. That's how you meet success. One other thing I want to add to this also, and it goes back to the like idea of talent. Thank you for your kind words to say that this, like, seems like a fully formed work, but this came after years also of like writing and failing and writing and failing. Do I'm a pretty confident writer, and I, again, not to let like ego like get too far into this, but like, I'm confident enough that even when I was writing this, I'll be like, I'm confident enough that I can write a manuscript that is a solid manuscript. But, and I want to give a shout out to my fellow Canadian writer Tim Welsh, who wrote the book Ley Lines. Please do read that book. He made a point that, me writing this book, it was his debut also, was me teaching myself how to write a novel. And that was very true of my experience with Drinking the Ocean. I thought I knew how to write a story, but I had to actually like go through the process of like doing this movie. Like, am I actually really writing the story properly? Um, and I did have a lot of help from like editors, and like I was part of a writing group for a really long time who were able to tell me to my face what works and what doesn't. And part of success in writing, apart from like a natural talent, is being able to also know your flaws as a writer and writing quirks that may not write out. So to give again a concrete example, when I first started writing Drink the Ocean, it was a very stream of conscious story. And that's kind of coming out of this like very emotional place where I was writing like this story, and like it was not working. And people
Mhm.
told me it was not working. So I changed my style to what I would describe as a more like lyrical realist style, to have it more grounded away from like the thoughts and the confines of these characters' minds. And I think that was a lot more successful. But I needed somebody to actually tell me that this wasn't working for it to be successful. So, like, talent is great, but writers, no matter how much we'd like to say this, don't work in isolation. They don't work in
Yeah.
isolation from the industry. They don't work in isolation from other writers. They don't work in isolation from readers, obviously, and the readers are the ones who will like really crush your ego in the best possible way to say that this is not working. Um, and they're also in conversation with other works. Like, I was like reading voraciously throughout this period, partly because like I want to go back to reading, but also like I'm reading works of literary fiction to be like, okay, how is this guy writing this story, and how I benefit from that?
That makes me feel a little bit better because I always feel like somehow it's magic that you all turn out these books that we love so much, and I'm so far from understanding the process. So thank you for that answer. I love that. Now, I do have a question for you. I'm not sure how well this will make sense, but if you were going to recommend your work, because you have some short stories out there as well,
Mhm.
obviously, to someone who didn't know you were an author and hadn't read any of your works, what would you tell them about your style? Do you have a style, do you feel, or does it change with your works?
I think it might change with some works depending on them. For example, like I've started dabbling into writing speculative fiction, even though I'm primarily a literary writer. But even with my spec works, I used this term actually like a few seconds ago, lyrical realism. So people who have read this works have often said that there's something very poetic about the style. Um, and I would say that's true. Like that's very deliberate. Like part of it is like that's just what comes out, but it's partly like out of this desire to want to write sentences that again have a sense of precision, ground the reader into the reality that I'm trying to present, but also without being too purple in my prose, elevate normal reality by like injecting emotion and depth into it. And that's something I get from like reading a lot of poetry. Poetry can be
Mm,
really abstract and can be very emotive, but I wanted to kind of do with my prose sentences what poets do with their sentences, if that makes sense. And as somebody who's read the book,
mhm.
I don't know if that actually comes out in reading it, but that's at least my intention as like a stylist, as a reader. Sorry, as a
Yeah,
writer rather.
yeah, yeah. No, I mean, I think I love that sort of lyrical realism. I love that. That's beautiful. Okay, so now I want to get to because you just mentioned Tim Welsh. So we really love sharing recommendations with our listeners. And so, what are you currently reading? And are there any titles or authors you've read in the past that you'd really like us to highlight?
This is my favorite part of these interviews because I love showcasing other writers that I love. So at this exact moment, I'm reading one of the last works of one of my favorite writers, which is Cormac McCarthy's Stella. I'm like Cormac McCarthy is. I mean, there's certainly controversies around his personal life, and even controversy around him as a writer. He
Hmm.
has his flaws. Certainly, he's not a writer who writes women well, and he was the first person to admit it. But at the same time, there's something about Cormac McCarthy's writing, which again, it has that like for those who love his works, his prose is so like King James. It's so biblical. It's so turgid and fierce, but at the same time he also writes reality. But at the same time he balances like the reality of whether like environment that he's describing with these bits of like surrealism almost. And it's something that like I'm really attracted to that. Like, for those who read Blood Meridian, my favorite work of his,
Oh, wow.
again, a very pitch perfect, at least in my reading, like account of like life in the Southwest in the mid 19th century. But at the same time, it is so bizarre, it is so bloody, it is so like and the style of the which he writes like adds to that sense of like it's it's Zane Grey on mescaline. That's the best way that I can describe Cormac McCarthy for those who haven't read him. It's so weird, but also like he's somebody who's like he researches extensively. He wants to bring you to the reality of the situation, but just through his own particular lens. Another writer that I would really ask people to look into is Daniyal Mueenuddin. I have a copy of his work right now. In Other Rooms, Other Wonders was a book of interlinked short stories that he wrote a couple of years ago that was, I want to say, nominated or shortlisted for the Pulitzer. He's a Pakistani-American writer. He divides his time from between the US and Pakistan. And this is a collection of short stories that depicts the lives of ordinary people in rural Pakistan who live like
Mhm.
kind of like feudal lifestyle. I think, in my estimation, one of the best writers of Pakistani origin writing in English right now. So I highly,
Oh,
highly, highly
wow.
recommend him.
Great.
An outstanding collection. I can't speak highly of enough. One of the writers who's always influenced me, who again has his controversies, especially because he's a Western writer who, I mean, lived much of his life in Morocco and like the very sound arguments that he does write in kind of like Oriental style is Paul Bowles. I'm holding up a collection of his travel writings, which I always recommend. If anybody is looking into Paul Bowles, I would start with his seminal work, The Sheltering Sky, which again, if you read it, is Bowles had a very acute eye for the exotic. And he wrote in this very realistic style. But again, there's something about it that like veers into surrealism. And there's something about the quality of this prose that like he's taking ordinary reality, but elevating it slightly in a way that's very hard to describe. You really have to read it. Apart from The Sheltering Sky, I do recommend his travel writing. The book that I have next to me from Echo Press, Travels Collected Writings by Paul Bowles, I do recommend because he is an outstanding travel writer. And for whatever people can say about him, about he's very much a American of the first part of the 20th century, who has a bit of a paternalistic eye towards the foreign, which is something that I think needs to be said. But at the same time, he is an excellent camera, if that makes sense, as far as the way that he, as like a travel writer. And that's why I really do highly recommend him to anybody. His short stories are also outstanding. Like read his collection of any collection of short stories, like and read stories like The Delicate Prey and A Distant Episode, which are two of like the most brutal but two of the finest short stories I've ever read.
Oh, wow.
I can go on with the subject, but I'll just end off by saying one of the influences in writing Drinking the Ocean was Sufi poetry. And figures like Rumi are very highly touted, and certainly people should read Rumi. Although do read a translation of Rumi where the Islamic aspects of Rumi's writings are not to be removed, because there are lots of translations by people like Coleman Barks which are frankly a bit denatured. If there's another author that I highly recommend, is the one that I referenced earlier. It's Abdullah Ansari. There's a translation by somebody by the name of A.G. Farhadi. He is a beautiful, like, I mean, this is obviously a translation, and this work that I've just put up to the camera is not just a translation of his poetry, but it's also about his life. And maybe the aspects of his life and his work may be a bit too dense for people who aren't really well versed in Islam or Sufism, but please pick it up and read some of his poetry. Like the poem that I referenced in this story, like it has a beauty that you see in all of his poetry. If you want poetry that can speak to people at a sacred level, but also can speak to people at a secular level, in this, even though he's talking about God, in the way that he examines love and how love can completely consume a human being, this is it. Please look into him. I'd really highly recommend that.
Wow. Those are some amazing recommendations. And yeah, the Cormac McCarthy, after all the controversy came out, I always wanted to read Blood Meridian. And then I thought, yeah, I'm not sure I can read it, only because of the how graphic it may be, that I've read other people talk about. And I don't have that. I struggle with stuff like that. But anyway, I might still look at McCarthy based on what you said. So we'll see.
I think that if you don't want to read something as nearly like violent as that, is All the Pretty Horses is a
Yeah.
beautiful story. There's violence in it, but it's not overwhelming. And for me, All the Pretty Horses and his trilogy, Cities on the Plain and The Crossing, which in my estimation is his most underrated work, are very good depictions of people grappling with a lost lifestyle and people grappling with a theme that is very important to me in my writing, is how people's idealism gets defeated by the reality with which we live in. And All the Pretty Horses is a really good example of that.
Okay. All right. I'll look into that for sure. So you did kind of give us a hint that you're currently working on something. So is it anything you can talk about at all in terms of what it might be and when we might be able to expect it?
So I'm working on, at this exact moment, a speculative fiction short story, which is going to be published in Augur magazine in fall of this year. I'm kind of going through the editing process of it. So if you want to see Saad's writing in the speculative mode, please look into that. Apart from that, I'm writing novel number 2. I'm about 60,000 words into it. It's tentatively titled The Spectacle. It's based in a fictional Muslim majority country going through a civil war. told from the perspective of two characters that are kind of at like the opposite ideological ends of the Civil War. You can kind of tell by this description, for those who read Drink in the Ocean, like I really love like multi-perspective stories, especially multi-perspectives where people are like looking at the world from like a different ideological or philosophical lens. When that comes out, all I can say is I'm really desperately trying to finish draft number 1 as soon as possible.
Yeah.
And just see who wants to pick it up. So I don't have a timeline for that, but like, do wish me well in the process of trying to sell novel number 2 out into the world, because I'm very excited about the story and I do want to see it out. But number 1, I need to finish it, and number 2, I want somebody to fall in love with it as much as I need them to fall in love with it.
Just from you talking about it, that absolutely sounds fascinating to me. I would love to read that. I look forward to it. I am going to be sending out a lot of prayers and positive thoughts for you to first finish it, and then for someone to pick it up, and
Yes.
and for us to see it soon. Saad, thank you so much. This has been a really wonderful discussion, and thank you for writing one of my favorite stories and certainly characters of 2025. I really so appreciate it, and I hope that you'll come back and talk to me again.
I'd be more than happy to, and thank you so much for having me.
Great. Thank you. Happy reading, everyone.
Thank you for joining us on our bookish journey. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, rating, and reviewing Canada Reads American Style wherever you listen. You can connect with the podcast and Rebecca on Instagram at Canada Reads American Style, and with Tara at On a Branch Reads. Until next time, keep reading.